25,000 fans packed into one of the world's most iconic venues to witness Whitney Houston at the absolute peak of her powers. The Bodyguard soundtrack wouldn't come for another year, but Whitney was already royalty. The concert had been flawless so far. Every note crystalline and perfect, every movement commanding, every moment proving why they called her the voice. But then during the intimate acoustic section of her set, something completely unexpected happened. A woman in the third row managed to slip past security and handed Whitney a simple manila envelope. No one thought much of it at first. Fans constantly tried to give Whitney letters, flowers, teddy bears, anything to connect with their idol. But when Whitney opened that envelope and saw what was inside, the voice went completely silent. She stopped singing mid-verse. Her hands began trembling. The 27-year-old superstar who had conquered every stage in the world suddenly looked like a lost little girl. Then she did something that shocked the entire arena. She sat down right there on the stage floor, still holding the envelope, and began crying so hard that her entire body shook. 25,000 people held their breath as they witnessed Whitney Houston having what looked like a complete breakdown in front of them. What was in that envelope that could devastate the strongest voice in music? The answer would reveal a truth about Whitney that she had been hiding from the world for years. A truth about lost innocence, crushing pressure, and the little girl who just wanted to sing in church before the whole world decided who she should become. Her name was Patricia Jenkins, and she had been carrying that photograph for almost 20 years. The actual original photograph, taken on a sunny Sunday morning in 1968 at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. Patricia had been the church photographer, a volunteer position she took seriously because documenting moments of worship was sacred work. On that Sunday in May 1968, she was setting up to photograph the adult choir when she heard something that made her stop. A voice, pure, clear, angelic, coming from the children's section. Patricia turned her camera and saw a little girl standing on a wooden box to reach the microphone. The child was maybe 5 or 6, wearing a simple white dress with lace trim. Her hair was pulled back with a ribbon, and her eyes were closed as she sang How Great Thou Art with conviction that seemed impossible for someone so young. The adults had stopped their conversations and were staring at this little girl in wonder. Patricia raised her camera and captured 3 photographs. The child singing with her whole heart, completely unaware of the adults watching, completely absorbed in the joy of worship. When the song ended, the little girl smiled shyly at the applause and climbed down to sit next to her mother. That little girl was Whitney Elizabeth Houston. Patricia kept those photographs in her collection, never thinking much about them until 1985 when she turned on the radio and heard a voice that made her freeze. She knew that voice. She had heard it 17 years earlier in a church, coming from a little girl on a wooden box. Patricia pulled out her old photograph and stared at the child singing. It was the same person now on every radio station, every magazine cover. The little girl from New Hope Baptist had become Whitney Houston, the biggest star in the world. Over the years, Patricia watched Whitney's career explode with mixed emotions. Pride because she remembered the pure joy on the little girl's face. Sadness because as Whitney became more famous, she seemed to lose that joy. The woman on television looked polished, professional, perfect, but her eyes looked tired in a way that little girls' eyes never had. Patricia noticed something most fans didn't see. In every interview, every performance, Whitney seemed to be performing even when she wasn't singing. There was a guardedness, a careful control that felt miles away from the uninhibited joy Patricia had photographed in that church. By 1991, the contrast had become heartbreaking. Whitney was at the peak of her commercial success, but Patricia could see the toll. The tabloids were brutal, constantly criticizing everything. There was pressure from the Black community saying she wasn't Black enough, pressure from the pop world saying she was too Black, pressure from everyone to be everything to everybody. Patricia made a decision. She was going to give Whitney something no one else could give her, a reminder of who she was before the world decided who she should be. Patricia chose the best of the 3 photographs, the one where little Whitney's face showed pure, uncomplicated joy. She had it professionally preserved and placed it in a manila envelope. On the outside, she wrote, "For Whitney, from someone who remembers when singing made you smile." Patricia used her entire savings to buy a 3rd-row ticket for Whitney's Madison Square Garden show on June 14th, not to see the concert, but to get that envelope into Whitney's hands. The night of the show, Patricia wore her Sunday best and held the envelope through the entire first half, waiting for the right moment. That moment came during the acoustic section, when Whitney settled onto a stool to perform Where Do Broken Hearts Go. As Whitney began the gentle opening notes, Patricia felt her heart racing. All her planned words disappeared. Whitney was absorbed in the performance, eyes closed, voice carrying vulnerability. Security was lighter during the acoustic section. Patricia stood slowly, legs shaking, and approached the barrier separating audience from stage. Up close, the exhaustion was more visible. Dark circles under Whitney's eyes that makeup couldn't hide. Her voice was flawless, but there was something mechanical about her performance, as if she was going through perfectly rehearsed motions. As Whitney reached the bridge, Patricia held up the envelope and called out just loud enough to be heard, "Whitney, from New Hope Baptist." Whitney's eyes snapped open. Her singing faltered as she looked at Patricia and the envelope. The church name had broken through Whitney's performance armor. This wasn't just another fan with another letter. This was something from before. Whitney stopped singing completely. The band gradually ceased playing. 25,000 people watched in puzzled silence as Whitney walked to the edge of the stage and knelt down to accept the envelope. "From New Hope?" Whitney asked quietly, her microphone broadcasting it throughout the arena. Patricia nodded, tears already forming. "I was there the first time you sang for us. You were just a little girl." Whitney looked down at the envelope, reading the words. "For Whitney, from someone who remembers when singing made you smile." For several long seconds, Whitney just stared. Then she sat down on the edge of the stage and carefully opened the envelope. Madison Square Garden was so quiet that the rustle of Whitney pulling the photograph from the envelope could be heard throughout the venue. The massive screens showed Whitney's face in close-up as she looked at the image. At first, confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like grief mixed with wonder. It was a 5x7-inch color photograph, remarkably well preserved. It showed a little girl in a white dress standing on a wooden box in a small church. The child's eyes were closed, mouth open in song, small hands gripping the microphone stand. But what made the photograph extraordinary was the expression on the little girl's face. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The joy of someone doing exactly what they were born to do without any thought of fame or expectation. Whitney stared at the photograph for a full minute while 25,000 people waited in silence. Those watching on big screens could see tears beginning to form, then fall. Then they could see Whitney Houston, the woman who had spent years learning to control every public emotion, completely lose that control. She brought the photograph close to her face, as if trying to see every detail. Her shoulders began to shake. The microphone she was still wearing picked up the sound of her crying, soft at first, then harder, then with the kind of raw pain that made everyone in the arena understand they were witnessing something deeply private and important. Patricia, still standing at the barrier, was crying too. She had imagined many possible reactions to the photograph, but she hadn't fully prepared for this level of emotional response. Bobby Brown, Whitney's husband at the time, was backstage and immediately started to come out, worried that something was wrong. But Whitney's tour manager stopped him, somehow understanding that this was something Whitney needed to experience alone. For 5 minutes, Whitney Houston sat on the edge of the Madison Square Garden stage, holding a photograph of her childhood self, and cried. The audience didn't call out, didn't applaud, didn't do anything except witness. Many of them were crying too, though they didn't fully understand why. Finally, Whitney wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, looked at Patricia, and spoke into her microphone. "How old was I?" 7 years old, Patricia called back. "It was your first solo. Your mama was so proud." Whitney nodded slowly, looking back at the photograph. "I remember this dress. My grandmother made it. I remember being scared because the microphone was so tall and they had to find a box for me to stand on." She paused, her voice breaking. "But I wasn't scared of singing. I was just scared I wouldn't be tall enough to reach." The audience laughed softly, a release of tension, but Whitney wasn't laughing. She was still staring at the photograph with an intensity that suggested she was trying to memorize every detail. "Do you know what I see when I look at this picture?" Whitney asked, her voice now carrying through the arena's sound system to all 25,000 people. "I see a little girl who just loved to sing. She didn't think about critics. She didn't worry about record sales. She didn't care if she was black enough or pop enough or good enough. She just loved music and loved God, and that was enough." Whitney stood up slowly, still holding the photograph like it was precious. She walked back to center stage and addressed her audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to share something with you. The woman who gave me this photograph just gave me something I didn't even know I had lost." The crowd listened intently. When you become successful, people start telling you who you are. The record company tells you what music you should make. Your publicist tells you what you should say. Critics tell you what's wrong with you. Fans tell you what they need from you. Whitney's voice was steady but filled with emotion. And somewhere in all of that, somewhere between the #1 hits and the sold-out concerts and the awards and the criticism, I forgot about that little girl. She pointed to the photograph. That little girl who sang because it made her happy. Not because it would make her rich or famous. Just because it felt like what she was supposed to do. She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. I miss her. I miss being her. The raw honesty hung in the air. This was Whitney Houston, one of the most successful entertainers in the world, admitting she had lost something precious. I want to tell you something I've never said publicly before. There are mornings when I wake up and I don't want to sing. Not because I don't love music, but because singing has become about so many other things. Sales numbers and chart positions and what the critics will say. The arena was silent. This photograph, Whitney said, holding it up for the screens, this is who I was before all of that. This is who I want to find my way back to. A voice from the crowd. We love you, Whitney. Whitney smiled through her tears. I know you do. And I love you too. But I need to learn to love that little girl in this picture again. Because she's the real me. Everything else is just performance. Patricia, still at the stage barrier, called out. Sing like her, Whitney. Sing like that little girl, just once. Whitney looked at Patricia, then at the photograph, then at her band. She walked over and spoke quietly. They nodded and began setting up for something different. What Whitney did next wasn't planned or rehearsed. She asked her band to play a simple arrangement of How Great Thou Art, the same hymn from that photograph 23 years earlier. Before she started, she made one more statement. I'm not going to sing this like Whitney Houston, the entertainer. I'm going to sing it like that 7-year-old girl in the church. No runs, no big notes, no showmanship. Just a simple hymn sung the way she used to sing it. Then she closed her eyes and she sang. What happened next was unlike anything anyone had heard from Whitney before. Her voice was still powerful, still beautiful, but stripped of all the technical flourishes that had become her trademark. No extended runs, no big climactic high notes. Just pure, simple, honest singing. The effect was devastating. In its simplicity, it was more moving than any of her technically brilliant performances. Because what the audience heard wasn't the voice. It was a voice. A human voice expressing genuine emotion and faith. When Whitney finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then the entire arena erupted in applause that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Not the usual screaming of a pop concert. It was respectful, emotional applause of people who had just witnessed something sacred. Whitney opened her eyes and smiled. For the first time that night, it was the same smile from the photograph. Genuine, unguarded, happy. Thank you, she said to Patricia. Thank you for remembering who I was. Patricia called back, you still are her, Whitney. You never stopped being her. You just forgot for a little while. Whitney nodded, wiping her eyes. I'm going to keep this photograph. I'm going to put it somewhere I can see it every day. And every time I start to forget who I really am, I'm going to look at that little girl and remember. What happened that night didn't end when the concert did. It was the beginning of a transformation that would affect the rest of Whitney's career. Backstage, after the show, Whitney spent nearly an hour with Patricia Jenkins, asking everything she could remember about that day at New Hope Baptist Church. She wanted every tiny detail that might help her reconnect with that memory. I remember your grandmother sitting in the front pew, crying with pride, Patricia told her. And your mother Sissy was standing right behind you, ready to help if you needed it. But you didn't need any help. You knew exactly what to do. Did I seem nervous? Whitney asked. Patricia shook her head. You seemed like you were exactly where you belonged. Like singing wasn't something you had to do. It was just who you were. Whitney made a decision that night that would significantly impact her approach to music. She had the photograph professionally framed and placed it in her dressing room at home. More significantly, she began requiring that it be in every dressing room of every venue where she performed. Her tour crew started calling it Whitney's Mirror, because she would spend time before each show looking at it, talking to the little girl in the photograph, reminding herself why she sang. The photograph became Whitney's tool for reconnecting with her authentic self whenever the pressures of fame became overwhelming. Friends and colleagues noticed changes in Whitney's approach to work. She became more selective about projects, choosing songs that felt meaningful rather than just commercially viable. The Whitney Houston who emerged after that night was more willing to take artistic risks, more willing to say no to things that didn't align with her values, and more willing to be vulnerable in her performances. Music historians speculate this moment influenced Whitney's decision to take on the Bodyguard project. The vulnerability and authenticity she displayed that night became central to her portrayal of Rachel Marin. The rawness she brought to "I Will Always Love You" came from the same place of emotional honesty that the photograph had helped her rediscover. Patricia Jenkins and Whitney Houston maintained a friendship until Whitney's death in 2012. They would speak every few months, and Patricia attended several more concerts. Each time, Whitney would glance toward the wings where Patricia stood, acknowledging the woman who had given her back a piece of herself. The photograph incident became legendary among Whitney's fans. Bootleg recordings of that Madison Square Garden concert became highly sought after, not for the music, but for the moment of raw humanity captured. The story spread through the music industry, inspiring other artists to think about the relationship between their authentic selves and their public personas. When Whitney struggled in later years, Patricia was one of the few people who could reach her. During dark moments, Patricia would remind her of that little girl in the white dress who sang because it made her happy. "Look at her," Patricia would say during difficult calls. "That's who you really are. Not what the tabloids say. Just that little girl who loved to sing." Whitney kept the photograph until her death. It was found among her belongings at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, still in its frame, suggesting she had brought it even for a brief stay. After Whitney's death, Patricia spoke at memorial services, sharing the story of that night. "The world lost an incredible voice," Patricia said, "but I hope people remember that behind that voice was a little girl who just wanted to make beautiful music. That's who Whitney was at her core. That's who she spent her whole life trying to get back to." The story has become more than just a concert anecdote. It's become a cultural touchstone about authenticity, pressure, and the cost of fame. It reminds us that even the most successful people can lose themselves in the pursuit of perfection. What made that photograph so powerful wasn't just what it showed, but what it represented. A version of Whitney Houston who existed before the weight of expectation, before the pressure to be everything to everyone, before the criticism and scrutiny. In that photograph, Whitney was just a child doing what she loved for no reason other than joy. That's something that gets lost for many artists as they achieve success. The thing they loved becomes a commodity, a source of stress. The joy gets replaced by obligation. Whitney's emotional response wasn't just nostalgia. It was grief for a lost version of herself. The little girl in that white dress didn't know about platinum records or critical reviews. She just knew that when she sang, she felt close to God and close to herself. That photograph helped Whitney remember that the power of her voice didn't come from technical skill alone. It came from authentic connection between her true self and her artistic expression. When she sang like that 7-year-old girl, without pretense, she was more powerful than when she sang to impress. The story also reveals something about the relationship between artists and their audiences. Patricia didn't give Whitney that photograph to create drama. She gave it because she could see the superstar had lost something precious, and Patricia had evidence it once existed. Patricia was giving Whitney permission to be imperfect, to be human, to be that little girl again. And Whitney's response showed how desperately she needed that permission. Today, the story is taught in music schools as an example of maintaining artistic authenticity. It's used in psychology courses to discuss the impact of external pressure on self-identity. It's referenced in discussions about fame, success, and mental health. But most importantly, it's remembered by the 25,000 people who were there that night. Many say it was the most powerful concert moment they ever witnessed, not because of technical brilliance, but because of raw human truth. The photograph represented a map back to Whitney's authentic self. In her later years, when addiction and struggles threatened to define her public image, those who knew the real Whitney would point to that photograph, and that moment as evidence of who she really was underneath all the pain. Whitney Houston died too young at 48, her incredible voice silenced. But that photograph, and the moment it created, remains as a reminder. We are not defined by our achievements or struggles. We are defined by the core of who we are. The part that exists before the world starts telling us who we should be. That little girl in the white dress, standing on a wooden box, singing with pure joy. That was the real Whitney Houston. Everything else was just what happened to her along the way. This incredible story shows us that sometimes the most valuable gift isn't praise or admiration. It's a reminder of who we were before we learned to be afraid. Whitney spent years trying to meet impossible expectations, trying to be perfect for everyone. Then a simple photograph reminded her she had once just been a little girl who loved to sing. That reminder didn't solve all of Whitney's problems or erase the pressures she faced, but it gave her something precious. A touchstone, a way to reconnect with her authentic self when everything felt like performance. Who are you before the world tells you who you should be? What would your photograph look like? If this story touched you and made you think about your own authentic self, hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to be reminded of who they really are. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more incredible stories that reveal the human beings behind the legends. Until next time, remember that your truest self is the one that existed before you learned to perform for others. That's who you really are.